of an enduring object is, however, capable of more or less completeness of realization. Thus, in different stages of its career, a wave of light may be more or less corpuscular. A train of such waves at all stages of its career involves social order, but in the earlier stages this social order takes the more special form of loosely related strands of personal order. This dominant personal order gradually vanishes as the time advances. Its defining characteristics become less and 54J less important, as their various features peter out. The waves then become a nexus with important social order, but with no strands of personal order. Thus the train of waves starts as a corpuscular society, and ends as a society which is not corpuscular. Section IV. Finally, in the cosmological scheme here outlined, one implicit assumption of the philosophical tradition is repudiated. The assumption is that the basic elements of experience are to be described in terms of one, or all, of the three ingredients: consciousness, thought, sense perception. The last term is used in the sense of conscious perception in the mode of presentational immediacy. Also in practice, sense perception is narrowed down to visual perception. According to the philosophy of organism, these three components are unessential elements in experience, either physical or mental. Any instance of experience is dipolar, whether that instance be God or an actual occasion of the world. The origination of God is from the mental pole, the origination of an actual occasion is from the physical pole, but in either case these elements, consciousness, thought, sense perception, belong to the derivative, impure, phases of the concrescence, if in any effective sense they enter at all. This repudiation is the reason why, in relation to the topic under discussion, the status of presentational immediacy is a recurrent theme throughout the subsequent first of these lectures. Part 2: Discussions and Applications. Chapter I: Fact and Form. Section I. 62 All human discourse which bases its claim to consideration on the truth of its statements must appeal to the facts. In none of its branches can philosophy claim immunity to this rule. But in the case of philosophy the difficulty arises that the record of the facts is in part dispersed vaguely through the various linguistic expressions of civilized language and of literature, and is in part expressed more precisely under the influence of schemes of thought prevalent in the traditions of science and philosophy. In this second part of these lectures, the scheme of 63 thought, which is the basis of the philosophy of organism, is confronted with various interpretations of the facts widely accepted in that European tradition, literary, philosophic, and scientific. So far as concerns philosophy, only a selected group can be explicitly mentioned. There is no point in endeavoring to force the interpretations of divergent philosophers into a vague agreement. What is important is that the scheme of interpretation here adopted can claim for each of its main positions the express authority of one, or the other, of some supreme master of thought: Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant. But ultimately nothing rests on authority. The final court of appeal is intrinsic reasonableness. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. His personal endowments, his wide opportunities for experience at a great period of civilization, his inheritance of an intellectual tradition not yet stiffened by excessive systematization, have made his writings an inexhaustible mine of suggestion. Thus, in one sense, by stating my belief that the train of thought in these lectures is Platonic, I am doing no more than expressing the hope that it falls within the European tradition. But I do mean more. I mean that if we had to render Plato's general point of view with the least changes made necessary by the intervening 2,000 years of human experience in social organization, in aesthetic attainments, in science, and in religion, we should have to set about the construction of a philosophy of organism. In such a philosophy, the actualities constituting the process of the world are conceived as exemplifying the 39, 40 discussions and applications, ingression or participation, of other things which constitute the potentialities of definiteness for any actual existence. The things which are temporal arise by their participation in the things which are eternal. The 64 two-sets are mediated by a thing which combines the actuality of what is temporal with the timelessness of what is potential. This final entity is the divine element in the world, by which the barren inefficient disjunction of abstract potentialities obtains primordially the efficient conjunction of ideal realization. This ideal realization of potentialities in a primordial actual entity constitutes the metaphysical stability whereby the actual process exemplifies general principles of metaphysics, and attains the ends proper to specific types of emergent order. By reason of the actuality of this primordial valuation of pure potentials, each eternal object has a definite, effective relevance to each concrescent process. Apart from such orderings, there would be a complete disjunction of eternal objects unrealized in the temporal world. Novelty would be meaningless, and inconceivable. We are here extending and rigidly applying Hume's principle, that ideas of reflection are derived from actual facts. By this recognition of the divine element, the general Aristotelian principle is maintained that, apart from things that are actual, there is nothing either in fact or in efficacy. This is the true general principle which also underlies Descartes' dictum. For this reason, when we perceive any attribute, we therefore conclude that some existing thing or substance to which it may be attributed is necessarily present. 1n. Again, for every clear and distinct conception perceptio is without doubt something, and hence cannot derive its origin from what is not. To this general principle will be termed the ontological principle. It is the principle that everything is positively somewhere in actuality, and in potency everywhere. In one of its applications, this principle issues in the doctrine of conceptualism. Thus, 65. The search for a reason is always the search for an actual fact which is the vehicle of the reason. The ontological principle, as here defined, constitutes the first step in the description of the universe as a solidarity free of many actual entities. Each actual entity is conceived as an act of experience arising out of data. It is a process of feeling the many data, so as to absorb them into the unity of one individual satisfaction. Here, feeling is the term used for the basic generic operation of passing from the objectivity of the data to the subjectivity of the actual entity in question. Feelings are variously specialized. 1 Principles of Philosophy, Part 1, 52, translation by Haldane and Ross. And quotations from Descartes are from this translation. 2 Meditation IV, towards the end. 3 The word, solidarity, has been borrowed from Professor Wildenkar's Prezi. Dential Address to the Aristotelian Society, Session 1917-1918. The address. ~E interaction of body and mind develops the fundamental principle suggested by this word. Fact and form. 41. Operations, affecting a transition into subjectivity. They replace the neutral stuff of certain realistic philosophers. An actual entity is a process, and is not describable in terms of the morphology of a stuff. This use of the term, feeling, has a close analogy to Alexander's use of the term, enjoyment, and has also some kinship with Bergson's use of the term, intuition. A near analogy is Locke's use of the term, idea, including ideas of particular things, cf. his essay, 3, 2, 6, and 7. But the word, feeling, as used in these lectures, is even more reminiscent of Descartes. For example, let it be so. Still it is at least quite certain that it seems to me that I see light, that I hear noise and that I feel heat. That cannot be. False. Properly speaking, it is what is in me called feeling, sentire, and used in this precise sense that is no other thing than thinking. 5 In Cartesian language, the essence of an actual entity consists solely in the fact that it is a prehending thing, i.e., a substance whose whole essence or nature is to prehend. Point 6a. Feeling belongs to the positive species 66 of prehensions. There are 2 species of prehensions, the positive species and the negative species. An actual entity has a perfectly definite bond with each item in the universe. This determinate bond is its prehension of that item. A negative prehension is the definite exclusion of that item from positive contribution to the subject's own real internal constitution. This doctrine involves the position that a negative prehension expresses a bond. A positive prehension is the definite inclusion of that item into positive contribution to the subject's own real internal constitution. This positive inclusion is called its feeling of that item. Other entities are required to express how any one item is felt. All actual entities in the actual world, relatively to a given actual entity is subject, are necessarily felt by that subject, though in general vaguely. An actual entity is felt as said to be objectified for that subject. Only a selection of eternal objects are felt by a given subject, and these eternal objects are then said to have ingression in that subject. But those eternal objects which are not felt are not therefore negligible. For each negative prehension has its own subjective form, however trivial and faint. It adds to the emotional complex, though not to the objective data. The emotional complex is the subjective form of the final satisfaction. The importance of negative prehensions arises from the fact that actual entities form a system, in the sense of entering into each other's constitutions, that by the ontological principle every entity is felt by some actual entity, that, as a consequence of and every entity in the actual world of a concrescent actuality has some gradation of real relevance to that concrescence, that, in consequence of the negative prehension of an entity is a 4 cf. His space, time and deity, passum. 5 Meditation 2, Haldane and Ross translation. 6 For the analog to this sentence D. Meditation B. Substitute, ens pre. Hendens fort, ens cogitans. 42. Discussions and applications. Positive fact with its emotional subjective form, TP, there is a mutual sensitivity of the subjective forms of prehensions, so that they are not different to each other, the concrescence issues in one concrete field ing, the satisfaction. Section 2. 67 That we fail to find in experience any elements intrinsically ble of exhibition as examples of general theory is the hope of rationalism. This hope is not a metaphysical premise. It is the faith which forms the motive for the pursuit of all sciences alike, including metaphysics. Insofar as metaphysics enables us to apprehend the rationality of things, the claim is justified. It is always open to us, having regard to the imperfections of all metaphysical systems, to lose hope at the exact point where we find ourselves. The preservation of such faith must depend on an ultimate moral intuition into the nature of intellectual action that it should embody the adventure of hope. Such an intuition marks the point where metaphysics and indeed every science gains assurance from really dion and passes over into religion. But in itself the faith does not embody a premise from which the theory starts. It is an ideal which is seeking satisfaction. Insofar as we believe that doctrine, we are rationalists. There must, however, be limits to the claim that all the elements in the universe are explicable by theory. Theory itself requires that there be given elements so as to form the material for theorizing. Plato himself recognizes this limitation. I quote from Professor A. E. Taylor's summary of the Timaeus. In the real world there is always, over and above, law, a factor of the simply given, or brute fact, not accounted for and to be accepted simply as given. It is the business of science never to acquiesce in the merely given, to seek to explain it as the consequence, in virtue of rational law, of some simpler initial given. But, however far psi-ends may carry this procedure, it is always forced to retain some ment of brute fact, the merely given, in its account of things. It is the presence in nature of this element of the given, this cert or irrational as it has 68 sometimes been called, which Timaeus appears to be sonifying in his language about necessity. 7 So far as the interpretation of Plato is concerned, I rely upon the authority of Professor Taylor. But, apart from this historical question, a clear understanding of the given elements in the world is essential for any form of Platonic realism. For rationalistic thought, the notion of givenness carries with it a reference beyond the mere data in question. It refers to a decision whereby what is given, is separated off from what for that occasion is not. 7. Plato, The Man and His Work, Lincoln MacB, New York, 1927. Asterisk. Fact and form. 43. Given. This element of givenness in things implies some activity procuring limitation. The word decision does not here imply conscious judgment, though in some decisions, consciousness will be a factor. The word is used in its root sense of a cutting off. The ontological principle declares that every decision is referable to one or more actual entities, because in separation from actual entities there is nothing, merely nonentity, the rest is silence. The ontological principle asserts the relativity of decision, whereby every decision expresses the relation of the actual thing, for which a decision is made, to an actual thing by which that decision is made. But decision cannot be construed as a casual adjunct of an actual entity. It constitutes the very meaning of actuality. An actual entity arises from decisions for it, and by its very existence provides decisions for other actual entities which supersede it. Thus the ontological principle is the first stage in constituting a theory embracing the notions of actual entity, givenness, and process. Just as potentiality for process is the meaning of the more general term entity or thing, so decision is the additional meaning imported by the word actual into the phrase actual entity. Actuality is the decision amid potentiality. It represents stubborn fact which cannot be evaded. The real internal constitution of an actual 69 entity progressively constitutes a decision conditioning the creativity which transcends that actuality. The Castle Rock at Edinburgh exists from moment to moment, and from century to century, by reason of the decision effected by its own historic root of antecedent occasions. And if, in some vast upheaval of nature, it were shattered into fragments, that convulsion would still be conditioned by the fact that it was the destruction of that rock. The point to be emphasized is the insistent particularity of things experienced and of the act of experiencing. Bradley's doctrinate _ wolf-eating lamb is a universal qualifying the absolute as a travesty of the evidence. That wolf eat that lamb at that spot at that time. The wolf knew it, the lamb knew it, and the carrion birds knew it. Explicitly in the verbal sentence, or implicitly in the understanding of the subject entertaining it, every expression of a proposition includes demonstrative elements. In fact, each word, and each symbolic phrase, is such an element, exciting the conscious prehension of some entity belonging to one of the categories of existence. Section 3. Conversely, where there is no decision involving exclusion, there is no givenness. For example, the total multiplicity of Platonic forms is not given. But in respect of each actual entity, there is givenness of such forms. The determinate definiteness of each actuality is an expression of a selection from these forms. It grades them in a diversity of relevance. This 8cf. Logic, BK, I, CH, 2, Sect, 42. 44. Discussions and applications. Ordering of relevance starts from those forms which are, in the fullest sense, exemplified, and passes through grades of relevance down to those forms which in some faint sense are proximately relevant by reason of contrast with actual fact. This whole gamut of relevance is given, and must be referred to the decision of actuality. The term Platonic form has here been used as the 70 briefest way of indicating the entities in question. But these lectures are not an exegesis of Plato's writings. The entities in question are not necessarily restricted to those which he would recognize as forms. Also, the term idea has a subjective suggestion in modern philosophy, which is very misleading for my present purposes, and in any case it has been used in many senses and has become ambiguous. The term essence is used by the critical realists, also suggests their use of it, which diverges from what I intend. Accordingly, by way of employing a term devoid of misleading suggestions, I use the phrase eternal object for what in the preceding paragraph of this section I have termed a Platonic form. Any entity whose conceptual recognition does not involve a necessary reference to any definite actual entities of the temporal world is called an eternal object. In this definition, the conceptual recognition must of course be an operation constituting a real feeling belonging to some actual entity. The point is that the actual subject which is merely conceiving the eternal object is not thereby in direct relationship to some other actual entity, apart from any other peculiarity in the composition of that conceiving subject. This doctrine applies also to that primordial nature of God, which is his complete envisagement of eternal objects, yet is not thereby directly related to the given course of history. The given course of history presupposes his primordial nature, but his primordial nature does not presuppose it. An eternal object is always a potentiality for actual entities, but in itself, as conceptually felt, it is neutral as to the fact of its physical ingression in any particular actual entity of the temporal world. Potentiality is the correlative of givenness. The meaning of givenness is that what is given might not have been given, and that what is not given might have been given. Further, in the complete particular, givenness, for an actual entity there is an element of exclusiveness. The R71 various primary data and the concrescent feelings do not form a mere multiplicity. Their synthesis in the final unity of one actual entity is another fact of givenness. The actual entity terminates its becoming in one complex feeling involving a completely determinate bond with every item in the universe, the bond being either a positive or a negative prehension. This termination is the satisfaction of the actual entity. Thus the addition of another component alters this synthetic givenness. Any additional component is therefore contrary to this integral givenness of the original. This principle may be illustrated by our visual perception of a picture. The pattern of colors is given, for us, fact and form, 45. But an extra patch of red does not constitute a mere addition, it alters the whole balance. Thus in an actual entity the balanced unity of the total, givenness, excludes anything that is not given. This is the doctrine of the emergent unity of the superject. An actual entity is to be conceived both as a subject presiding over its own immediacy of becoming, and a superject which is the atomic creature exercising its function of objective immortality. It has become a being, and it belongs to the nature of every being, that it is a potential for every becoming. This doctrine, that the final satisfaction